My name is Evelyn Marston, and I am 62 years old. For most of my life, I believed I understood my family, our rhythms, our resentments, and our quiet loyalties. I lived alone on a peaceful piece of land I purchased in my mid-30s, 2.5 acres just outside a small Northern California town. That land was my sanctuary. It wasn't fancy, it held a small farmhouse, an aging barn, and a garden I tended like a second soul. But it was fully mine, bought outright, maintained through decades of quiet work, and worth a little over $260,000 the last time I'd checked. I assumed my family respected that. Or at least understood it. I retired from my job as a school librarian 5 years ago. I filled my days with gardening, volunteering at the local literacy center, and enjoying a calm life that felt earned. My younger sister, Lily, was the opposite, bright, social, endlessly dramatic, and always chasing the next shiny thing. She was 10 years younger, which meant I often felt more like her third parent than her sibling. We were never close, but I always thought she loved me in her own way. My parents were aging quickly. My mother's health had begun to slip, and my father's memory had become unreliable. Still, we had Sunday dinners every month, and even if there were small tensions, mostly about money or Lily's impulsive choices, I never imagined a storm was rising. One evening during one of those dinners, my father asked me, almost casually, if I ever intended to expand the property. When I said no, he gave me a strange look, something between concern and calculation. My mother said nothing, but her fork slowed in her hand. I brushed it off at the time, but the memory of that moment would later haunt me. Around that same period, Lily became engaged to a man named Eric. I tried to be optimistic for her. He was charming, strangely polished for someone with an unstable employment history, but he seemed to adore her. My parents were thrilled. Finally, they said, Lily had found the right man. But something about Eric bothered me from the start, not in a sinister way, but in the way someone bothers you when they talk more than they listen. As wedding planning ramped up, the noise around the event grew unbearable. My parents were obsessed with making it the event of the decade. Lily expected everything to be luxurious, glamorous, dramatic, like the weddings she saw on television. I remember quietly asking my mother if they could really afford all this. She waved her hand and said it was handled. I didn't know then that handled meant my land, the land I had bought with my own money, the land I had sacrificed years of my life for. Looking back, all the signs were there, the secretive glances, the unusual questions, the way my parents' tone shifted whenever finances came up. But I trusted them. I trusted the people who raised me. And it was that trust that would be used against me. The ordinary piece of my life was already cracking, I just didn't hear the fractures yet. Not until they became loud enough to split everything open. And eventually, they did. The day I learned the truth began so quietly it almost felt cruel. I was at home making coffee when the phone rang. It was a man from the county recorder's office. He said he was calling to confirm that I had received the mailed documents related to the recent transfer. I asked, "What transfer?" He paused. I remember the way his voice sharpened, slow and careful. "Ma'am, the deed transfer for your property." I felt a coldness crawl up my spine. I asked him to clarify. He told me the land, my 2.5 acres, my home, my security, had been transferred to another owner 3 months earlier. The new owner listed was my father. I nearly dropped the phone. I told the man there had to be a mistake. I told him the property wasn't for sale. I told him that I never signed any documents. He suggested, gently, that I come in to review the paperwork. I drove to the county office gripping the steering wheel hard enough to leave marks. When they handed me copies of the paperwork, my knees almost buckled. There, in black ink, was my signature. Except, it wasn't my signature. It was similar, disturbingly similar, but the loops were wrong, the pressure strokes uneven. A forgery, clean enough to fool the casual, sloppy enough to infuriate me. I walked out shaking. I sat in my car staring into nothingness. My parents had transferred my land. My land. The only asset I had besides my modest savings. And the transfer had already been followed by a sale. The property had been sold to an investor, cash deal, and when I checked the price, the bile rose in my throat. $260,000. Gone. I drove straight to my parents' house. My father was in the backyard, watering plants. My mother was at the kitchen table. I confronted them, trembling, holding the papers in my hand. At first, they denied everything. Then they minimized. Then, finally, my mother cracked and said the words that still echo inside my skull. Lily's wedding was important, Evelyn. You weren't using the land for anything meaningful. And you have no children. You won't need it the way she will. I felt something inside me collapse. They justified it. They spoke as though my life's work was disposable. As though my independence meant nothing. As though my stability could be sacrificed for Lily's fantasy wedding. My father muttered that they intended to pay me back eventually, though it was clear neither of them had the means. I walked out before the rage consumed me. 2 weeks later, after avoiding all family contact, I received a message from Lily. She said, brightly, as if nothing had happened, Eric wants to start a business, and we were wondering if you'd hire him at your nonprofit. Not only had my land paid for her wedding, but now her husband, the man whose lavish reception was built on the bones of my home, was asking me for a job. That was the moment something inside me shifted from grief to purpose. Revenge, I decided, would not be loud or vicious. It would be honest, documented, calculated. And entirely my own. To understand why my family assumed they could make such a choice for me, you need to understand the dynamics we grew up in. I was the firstborn. The responsible one. The one who raised herself when my parents were overwhelmed after Lily arrived unexpectedly at age 40. My parents adored Lily, celebrated her, excused her, protected her from the consequences that shape a person into a functioning adult. I became the built-in caregiver. I fed her, drove her to school, helped her with homework, and even paid some of her college expenses when my parents couldn't. My mother always used the same phrase, "You're stronger, Evelyn. Lily needs more help." It embedded into every decision, shaping decades of unspoken expectations. When I bought the land, my parents treated it as some eccentric hobby. They didn't understand what it represented: freedom. A safe place. Something I could rely on no matter what happened. In life. For them, land wasn't emotional, it was transactional. Something to be moved around like pieces on a board. Lily grew up believing the world owed her comfort. Money always seemed to find its way to her, either through my parents' sacrifices or my own quiet contributions. She wasn't malicious, but she was breathtakingly entitled. Her wedding was supposed to be the culmination of her specialness. A massive event with flowers imported from Europe, designer gowns, ice sculptures, a venue that cost more than my annual salary. She told me once that it had to be perfect because my whole life has been building to this. My parents internalized that belief. They saw Lily's happiness as their legacy. And they saw my independence as insulation. A buffer. A convenient cushion they could quietly borrow from without considering the weight of what they took. I think, in their minds, the land was never really mine. It was unused potential waiting to be redirected toward the daughter they thought needed it more. But motives, no matter how sentimental or misguided, don't justify betrayal. Still, understanding them helped me see the shape of the truth. My parents weren't villains. They were flawed, frightened people desperate to maintain an image of success for Lily. They wanted to give her a life that made them feel they had succeeded as parents. And in their desperation, they crossed a moral line they couldn't uncross. As for Lily, she lived in a bubble of unrealistic expectations. Her motivations were rooted in vanity, insecurity, and a shallow desire to be admired. But when I thought about her asking me for a job for her new husband, I realized something important: she truly didn't comprehend what had happened. Not the weight of it, not the theft, not the betrayal. She believed, truly believed, that everything in the family was a shared resource, and that I should simply be happy for her. The past made their choices predictable. But predictable didn't mean forgivable. I spent days replaying every sacrifice I had made growing up, every moment I stepped aside for Lily, every time I filled in gaps my parents left. And slowly, clarity emerged. If they viewed my independence as an endless resource, as something they could redirect at will, then the only ethical revenge was to show them, calmly, methodically, that I was no longer going to carry them. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to threaten. I was going to let the truth speak louder than any anger could. And the first step would be uncovering exactly how they had stolen my land. I began my investigation the way a librarian approaches a difficult archive, quietly, patiently, with meticulous detail. First, I requested every document associated with the transfer and sale of my property. The county recorder's office provided copies, and I spent hours studying each page. The forged signature. The notary's stamp. The witnesses listed. The dates. The discrepancies were small but numerous. My signature was wrong. The notary had signed on a date I was volunteering at the literacy center, confirmed by building entry logs. The supposed witness was someone I had never met. Most importantly, the notary's address led to a woman who had retired 2 years before the date on the document. Clear, undeniable fraud. Next, I visited a real estate attorney in town, an older man named Mr. Rosen who had a reputation for handling complex property disputes. He had kind eyes, but when I showed him the forged documents, his expression hardened. "This isn't sloppy work," he said. "This is someone who knew enough to be dangerous but not enough to be invisible." He asked if I had suspects. "My parents," I said quietly. He closed his notebook and looked at me for a long moment. "Evelyn, you have a strong legal case. You can pursue criminal charges, civil damages, or both." I asked what would happen if I did. He told me plainly, prison for whoever forged the signatures, possible charges for whoever benefited financially, restitution if the buyers were complicit, and potential voiding of the sale. But then he asked the question I had been dreading. "Do you want to destroy them?" Destroy them. The words echoed. That wasn't what I wanted. I wasn't seeking vengeance in flames, I wanted truth, accountability, and emotional equilibrium. I wanted them to understand the magnitude of what they had done. I wanted the deed of my own life returned to me, not by force, but by recognition of their wrongdoing. So I began documenting everything. I created a timeline, cross-referenced dates, printed emails, recorded calls with the county office, and interviewed the retired notary. I collected calendars, volunteer logs, and bank statements showing I had not received a penny from the sale. The more evidence I gathered, the clearer the story became. My parents had found a mobile notary recommended by a friend of Lily's. They had provided identification they kept in an old storage box from when I lived with them years ago, my expired passport. The notary, rushed and careless, had let them sign on my behalf. The sale had been completed within 2 days. Cash. No inspections. Their motive was written plainly in their electronic messages, wedding invoices, vendor deposits, and transfers to Lily's account. $260,000 evaporated into orchids, champagne fountains, custom lighting, live musicians, designer suits, spa packages, and international honeymoon tickets. My land had not been used for necessity. It had been used for spectacle. And they hadn't even considered telling me. The final piece of my investigation came when I requested the buyer's file. The investor had purchased 3 properties that week. My land was the cheapest. He had no interest in overturning the sale, but he did provide one crucial document, a scanned copy of the forged deed with my father's handwriting in the margin. That was the final confirmation I needed. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining betrayal. It was real. And armed with documentation, I was ready for the truth to unfold, not with anger, but with precision. With the evidence in hand, I arranged a quiet meeting with my parents. No threats. No shouting. Just facts. We met at their dining table, the same one where I'd eaten countless childhood meals. The same one where they decided I was expendable. I placed the documents in front of them, the forged signature, the notarization, the sale records, the buyer's file. I watched the color drain from my mother's face, watched my father's hands tremble. My mother tried to speak first. "Evelyn, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I said calmly. "You sold my land. You forged my signature. You broke the law." My father put his head in his hands. My mother tried to justify their actions again. "We thought we'd pay you back. Lily needed this. She deserves a beautiful life. Why does she deserve it more than I deserve my home?" My mother didn't answer. I showed them the notary's statement, the timeline, the proof that the notary couldn't have witnessed the signature, the digital messages referencing using the land for the wedding, and finally, the buyer's scanned note with my father's handwriting. They were cornered, not by me, but by reality. My father whispered, "I didn't know it would hurt you like this." "You didn't think about me at all," I replied. Silence. Then I asked the question I had been waiting to ask. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" My mother's eyes filled with tears. "No." It was the only honest thing she said in that moment. But the truth wasn't done unfolding. 2 days later, Lily called me. She sounded frantic. "Mom says you're trying to ruin the family." I told her I wasn't ruining anything. I was simply revealing the truth. She exploded, calling me selfish, dramatic, jealous. Jealous of her wedding, her life, her new husband. I listened quietly. And when she finally stopped to breathe, I said a single sentence that silenced her completely. "You spent my retirement on flower arches." The line went dead for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was small. "I didn't know." She asked for details. She cried. She apologized. And then, in the strangest twist of all, she said Eric was furious, not at me, but at my parents. His business plans had assumed financial support that no longer existed. He wasn't just a charming talker, he was financially dependent on my parents' fantasy. In the days that followed, cracks grew everywhere. My parents argued constantly. Lily confronted them in dramatic, tear-filled phone calls. Their carefully controlled image exploded, not because I revealed anything publicly, but because the truth had nowhere left to hide. I didn't shout. I didn't punish. I simply stood firm. The truth itself was the reckoning. And I knew the confrontation still ahead would not be between me and my parents, it would be between my parents and themselves, with me simply holding the mirror. The official confrontation took place in Mr. Rosen's office. My parents arrived looking exhausted, smaller than I had ever seen them. Lily and Eric came too. Lily's eyes were red from crying, and Eric looked like a man who had wandered into someone else's nightmare. Mr. Rosen laid everything out in simple, unemotional terms. The forgery. The fraudulent notarization. The illegal transfer. The sale. The financial paper trail showing exactly where the money went. The possible consequences. He explained my options: press charges. Pursue civil damages. Seek restitution through a negotiated settlement. Or allow the law to pursue the notary and hold my parents accountable. My mother started crying midway through the explanation. My father kept his gaze fixed on the desk. Lily's shoulders shook with silent sobs. I waited until Mr. Rosen finished. Then I spoke, calm and steady. "I'm not here to send anyone to jail. But I will not carry the consequences of your actions. I want acknowledgement, accountability, and restitution." My father finally looked up. "We don't have that kind of money." "I know," I said. "Which is why the repayment plan will be long-term, documented, and legally binding." I had already discussed the structure with Mr. Rosen: a lien on my parents' home. Garnishment of part of their pension payments. A formal, notarized confession of the fraudulent transfer to protect me from future liability. and a written statement acknowledging the wrongdoing. When I laid it out, my mother whispered, "This will destroy us." "It won't," I replied gently. But pretending nothing happened would destroy me. Then came the moment I had anticipated. Eric stood up, hands shaking. "I want to say something," he said. "Your parents misled me too. They told me they were financially secure. They told me they could help us start a business. I had no idea they used your land. I never would have allowed that." He looked at me directly. "I'm sorry." His apology, ironically, was the only sincere one in the room. Lily cried harder. "Evelyn, I didn't know. I swear. I thought Mom and Dad were paying for the wedding from savings." She wasn't lying. She was naive, self-centered, and careless, but she wasn't malicious. My parents agreed to the restitution plan, though reluctantly. Not because they wanted to repair things, but because the alternative, legal prosecution, terrified them. The confrontation ended quietly. No yelling. No dramatics. Just agreements, signatures, and the weight of reality. As I walked out of the attorney's office, something unexpected washed over me, not anger, but a deep, cleansing exhaustion. The kind of tired that follows a storm finally breaking. Revenge wasn't the point. The point was truth. The point was reclaiming what had been taken, not the land, which was gone, but my autonomy, my voice, my dignity. And though the confrontation was over, the consequences were only beginning. The consequences unfolded slowly, like a long winter thawing inch by inch. My parents' finances collapsed under the weight of the lien and the repayment agreement. They had to downsize significantly. Their dream of a comfortable retirement dissolved into a more modest reality, one shaped by accountability instead of illusion. For the first time in their lives, they had to live within limits. Lily and Eric faced their own unraveling. Eric had counted on my parents' financial support to launch his business. With that support gone, and with the weight of the scandal inside the family, he had to find real employment. He applied for jobs outside his comfort zone. He even circled back to ask if the nonprofit needed volunteers, not employees, just to build experience. It was humbling for him. Necessary. As for Lily, she experienced a shift I didn't expect. She began reaching out to me, not for money, not for support, but for understanding. She asked about my life, my work, my garden. She apologized repeatedly. At first I kept my distance, but slowly, cautiously, I allowed her back in. Not as a child I had to raise. As an adult learning to stand on her own. Meanwhile, the restorative payments trickled in each month. Small amounts, consistent, symbolic. They weren't enough to buy back the land, I had accepted that loss, but they were enough to validate the principle. Enough to restore the balance that had been broken. And there was a twist I didn't see coming. The investor who bought my land reached out months later. He was selling several properties and wanted to know if I had interest in making an offer on mine. I couldn't afford it. But through community connections and a grant program I'd worked with at the Literacy Center, an opportunity opened, a subsidized plot of land nearby, smaller but beautiful, quiet, perfect for a new beginning. I bought it. My parents learned about the new property months later. They asked if I would ever move back into relationship with them the way things used to be. No, I told them gently. But we can build something new. Something honest. The consequences were not revenge. They were growth born from truth. And every day, I felt the difference. I rebuilt my sanctuary. Smaller, but mine. I planted new fruit trees, built raised beds, and painted the porch a soft, hopeful blue. I found peace in creating something from the ashes. The consequences had reshaped all of us. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. And that led to the final chapter, the reflection that gave it all meaning. Looking back now, I understand that the land was never the true loss. The real wound was betrayal, the quiet, calculated assumption that my life was less valid, less deserving, less worthy of protection than the fantasy my parents wanted to build for my sister. But healing didn't come from punishment. It came from truth. From clarity. From boundaries that should have existed decades earlier. I rebuilt my sense of home, physically and emotionally. I no longer carry the burden of being the responsible child who absorbs every consequence. And my family no longer carries the illusion that I am their safety net. Lily visits sometimes. She helps in the garden. She listens more than she speaks now, and she's slowly learning what adulthood really means. Eric has become strangely respectful, occasionally even insightful. And my parents, they are quieter. Softer. Humbled in ways that pain alone could not have accomplished. I never regained the land that was taken from me. But I reclaimed myself. Justice, I've learned, isn't always about restoration. Sometimes it's about revelation, letting the truth settle into the cracks until everything false falls away. And for anyone listening to my story, I offer this. Family can make mistakes. Deep ones. But forgiveness does not mean returning to old roles or allowing repeated harm. Forgiveness can be quiet, firm, and shaped by boundaries. Justice can be gentle. Revenge can be ethical. And your life, your stability, your future, belongs to you alone. If you've ever been betrayed by those closest to you, ask yourself not how to hurt them, but how to reclaim yourself. That is the real victory. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, tell me, what would you have done in my place?